I don't think I really knew anything about liturgy like until I was virtually ordained. Like you remember me watching the NBA playoffs with the Roman Missal and a glass of scotch sitting outside of our house there.
That's the intro they're going to
studying
use for this.
I would literally do this. I had the Roman Missal watching the NBA playoffs, and I'm like, what am I supposed to say then? Where does this go? Okay,
God.
but you know, you got to do a little studying.
Well, welcome to Think Like a Jesuit. I am Father Eric Sundrup, and I'm joined today by my good friend Paddy Gilger. It's good to be with you. And today we will be tackling an important topic within the church, debates and problems with the liturgy.
This
Easy
has been,
stuff.
yeah, exactly. This is stuff we've, dealt with for many years and many times. But the controversies over the liturgy became a hot button issue just again recently with the announcement just a little while ago that from Pope Francis that the Latin Mass was no longer going to be celebrated without permissions, explicit permissions, around the dioceses of the United States of America and around the world. This, as you can imagine, whenever liturgy gets touched, it's an incredibly neuralgic hot button issue.
Yeah.
And so like all of these things, it exploded all around us. And so I thought we could talk a little bit today around what are the two sides of this issue, what is the controversy around it, why is it so important?
One of the things we're trying to do when you're talking about thinking like a Jesuit is to give a breadth of understanding, right? But you also got to know what's happening and how people are reacting. And for better, and many times for worse, Twitter is a good place to go to kind of get those reactions, right? So to show that side real quick of, this is good and it's calling us to the proper reforms, here's one from Massimo Fagioli. It's important Francis' speech today on the liturgy and liturgical reform. I would like to emphasize the danger, the temptation of liturgical formalism as we see today in those movements that try to go backwards and deny the Second Vatican Council itself.
In a similar vein, Chris Damian has tweeted, I love the traditional Latin Mass and I would love to go to Mass in the extraordinary form, but those parishes are often toxic cults of extremism and partisan ideology. On the other side of this debate, we see a tweet from Father Aaron Williams, who says, the people who are harmed by traditiones custodes are not sedevacantists, they're not rad trads, but the great numbers of Catholic faithful who, desiring the salvation of their souls and that of their families, lovingly adore our Lord in the same manner that Christians have for nearly 2,000 years. But then there are other people who've gone to the traditional Latin Mass, such as Amy Curtis, who tweets out, my Latin Mass parish is filling up an hour before the 11 p.m. Mass begins. People, especially young people and families, long for the solemnity and the dignity and the splendor of this Mass. We will outlast, she tweets, any attempt to squelch it.
If you're breaking it down into two different sides, there's a group that really feels that there's something important and sacred happening in the traditional Latin Mass. That's something they want to experience. There's a power in that, I think, that sort of cuts against the secular trends of society, and it adds to the mystery. I don't know if you've noticed this. Not everyone speaks Latin anymore.
So including me, motu proprio.
there's a sense that brings back some of that mystery and sacredness, right? And so that's really important to a lot of people. But one of the things that it does is it doesn't have many of the important reforms that the Second Vatican Council asked for.
Well, okay, so when the motu proprio came out, I remember, mostly what I wanted to do, honestly, was just I didn't want to pay attention to it because I knew it was going to be a hot button issue. And so despite the fact that, you and I are here, we're going to have these conversations with all of you, these are conversations, almost all of which I would just rather avoid, right? Because they're difficult, like they put us in tension.
Yeah, and I think that's the question is, why do we want to avoid them, right?
Exactly. Part of the reason I wanted to avoid that stuff is because I knew it was going to be tender. Like these are all neuralgic things, but this is a tender one. And I have to be honest, my first reaction was of sadness and sympathy for my friends for whom the traditional Latin Mass is important. And that was really the first thing I thought was like, this is going to be really hard for so-and-so, my friend. And these are people who I want to say explicitly are not opposed to Vatican II. These are advocates for the contemporary structuring of our church.
There was a great you sent me this. It was someone like that rewrote How the Grinch Stole Christmas with Pope Francis as the Grinch taking away the mass from all the Who's in Whoville, or what, or the Trads in Tradville, or whatever. I don't know what it's called.
Yes.
Which it was hilarious to read. But like that, I think that's how some people interpret this. Why would you take this from people? So, as we do these things like think like a Jesuit. Okay, so if you're going to think like a Jesuit, how are you going to approach this debate? Did Pope Francis do this because he is the recent reincarnation of the Grinch, right, and is trying to steal everything? Well, there's a temptation to go that way, and we see that all over the place, where you just turn someone you disagree with into the enemy and you don't hear what's going on there. I think if you're going to think like a Jesuit, well, what are the best possible reads on why this is happening? Well, Pope Francis has said a number of times, one of the things he's worried about is the lack of communion, right? As we pull away and we try to undo the communion that is universal in the Church that Vatican II is really talking about, I think that's one of the big modes here. And that cuts both ways too. It cuts also for churches where you had gotten so far from the Novus Order that you were adding all sorts of new stuff or adjusting that.
Yeah.
So that in both cases, he's saying, let's have a common liturgy shared together. So that commonality, that communion, I think is the best possible read you can give on that.
You're 100% right here. And the key, what it really says is that the key to understanding how these liturgies, what they are doing to us, is a discernment. The key is discernment, like which spirit is operative within us as we're using or living within this particular liturgy, and is it orienting us towards communion or away from it? Because that idea of a uniform Catholic liturgy just does not exist. And there's a temptation, right, for the traditional Latin Mass to be able to be, this is the only and one form of the Mass in the Church, and that's just not true. Like, it has never been true, and it is not true.
I think, like you're pointing out, one of the things that they point out in Vatican II, the way the people praise is the way the people will believe. And so if we start trying to get separate communities that are praying in a way that separates them from communion of the rest of the Catholic community, that's going to have effects on the rest, that's going to have effects on the Church and how we interact and work with each other. Being
a priest for some time now, I'm noticing in myself this desire to let the liturgy shape me rather than me continue to shape the liturgy.
Yeah.
And that sense, like, what is it shaping me into? It's shaping me into the relationship with this community that is not just mine here and now, but has lasted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's an incredible gift.
So that commonality, that communion, I think is the best possible read you can give on that. What's the read, people that are really hurt by this? Well, there was an experience of sacredness, right? There was an experience of, this is where I see God more easily, or that I've had a profound experience, right? And when you start messing with that, that's going to hurt, right? So I think you have to recognize the legitimacy of that and walk with people in that difficult experience and hurt.
I've spent, I think I told you, you would know very well, I've told you a million times. I used to, I worked during my regency on the reservation in South Dakota.
I don't remember you ever telling me about that.
Yeah, exactly, I'm sorry. But working out there, it was such a privilege to be able to be taught how to pray in Lakota by Lakota people. Mm-hmm. And so I would go to a sweat lodge ceremony, for example. And the singing, the praying there would happen all in Lakota. And that was the first time learning Lakota by singing the prayers that I thought to myself, there might be something to this Latin, actually. There might be something to this. That it set aside this sacred experience. Now, at the same time, I think that we have to be very clear, right? Like what Pope Francis was seeing in this motu proprio is the reason for its issuing is that he was seeing very clearly a tendency in the Church, especially in America, I think, for people who are practicing this form of liturgy to separate themselves into, semi-nostalgic communities that want to roll back some of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And that's real, and we can't deny it. Like, what good does that do to deny?
And I think that's one of the things that Francis is pointing out, that there's a reason they made some of the reforms. Mm-hmm. There's a reason they shifted some of those things in the liturgy. I truly trust that Pope Francis was spending the time with that type of discernment, and the people involved in this were doing that, and made I think what some would identify as a painful decision. But I think one of the benefits for me is that watching all that, I wanted to understand why such a strong reaction, and I had an opportunity too to talk to some students at the university too that were wondering what was going on, and to hear from their experiences about traditional Latin Mass or high church stuff that they want a little more of because of the sort of the secular soup they're swimming in all the time.
Yeah.
This provided an anchor.
Yeah.
And so, that for me, as look, I don't know the Tridentine Rite. I'm not going to start saying Mass that way. But that helped me as a priest be more attentive to, okay, what are some of the ways in the order, the Novus Ordo, or in the Mass that we have, that we can provide those opportunities, right? Or invite people in. Because it was a challenge to reanalyze some of that for me. I think that was really important.
I think there was, if we're going to talk about an actually enculturated liturgy, the question we have to ask is, what are we enculturating into? And so the question really there is, like, what the culture in which we are living today, what kind of culture is it? What are we allowing into this experience of the sacred worship that we're having? And what are we keeping out of this sacred experience that we're having there? These young people that are living in this world today of absolute lack of cohesion, lack of coherence. There is a sense of it, there being a spine, like a real tradition to be able to hold on to here. That kind of, maybe it's not a coincidence that I'm drawing like a vertical line here, right? That there is the sense of, okay, we have one point where we can actually be locked on to the divine. Now, the real question becomes then, how can we live that kind of relationship, that vertical relationship within this shared experience of the liturgy that we have today in our beautiful and integrated and enculturated liturgies that are not all the same and don't need to all look the same.
Right, yeah. I think can you get yourself to that place? I think that the challenge there too is, I think this might be harder in our country at this time, but to be told to do something for communal that's beyond you and to be challenged that way,
I think that's a great point.
By a authority structure, which is the Pope in Rome in this particular case. But no, we're all going to stick together on this. And like, no, because I mean, every parish, right? You identify even not just with the parish, but like the Mass time that you go to, and each Mass time is distinct.
This is mine,
right? And I don't go to that parish; I go to that parish at that time, right? There's a call here to recognize that when we're celebrating Mass together, it's in communion with the entirety of the Church, right? And that will make demands on us. And I think that is the really hard part of this debate. A demand is being made on us, right? And it's just challenging us, and we didn't ask for it.
So where does this leave us? I think that one of the things that really challenges us to confront is that we have to make a real decision about the kind of community, liturgical community and parish community that we're going to belong to. And there are a couple of priorities about that. The old style of belonging really was, in the American Catholic Church, was ethnic and geographical.
Right.
You belong to your local
right?
ethnic parish, right? I go to the Irish parish, I go to the Polish parish, I go to the Mexican parish, that kind of thing. But in these experiences that we're having today, what we're seeing is that people tend to seek out particular styles of liturgy. And that can be okay. But it's not just an easy thing to say, well, I'm going to go do the thing that's making me happy or satisfying my own desires. Instead, you may want to ask yourself to do an actual discernment. Am I being asked to make a decision of committing to my local community, even if the Mass is not so beautiful, even if the Mass is challenging for me? Can I participate and give myself to this particular place? Or is God calling me to commit to a particular style of spirituality? Do I need to go to my local Dominican parish? Do I need to go to the Franciscan parish? Or to find a priest who's really able to resonate with the movements of my heart?
So as we're summarizing here, I think one of the things you would invite someone who's concerned about or paying attention to these sort of liturgy wars and the different discussion there is, it can be an invitation into a discernment, right? It can be an invitation for you to see where God is calling you. And so I would enter that with courage and honesty, and I would, test the Spirit. We've talked about testing those movements. go to different places or parishes or types of liturgies and see what that experience is like, and let yourself be honest and trust the Spirit will work with you. I think that's a really important part of what we're talking about.
And that there will be people who experience the liturgy very differently than we do, and we can, in patience and attention, experience something of the joy that Christ is giving them in their own experiences of this. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. We're really grateful for your time and for your attention. If you want to learn anything more about the liturgy, you can find much more about that on americamagazine.org. Please like and subscribe to this video. We're really grateful that you joined us. On behalf of Father Eric Sundrup and America Media, I'm Father Paddy Gilger.